30 days. That's all it took for the most powerful women's tennis organization on the planet to watch $500 million dissolve into silence. They erased her name from their campaign, and the world erased their revenue in return. This isn't a story about tennis. This is a story about what happens when an institution mistakes a star for a servant and discovers far too late that the power was never theirs to begin with. Nobody saw the collapse coming, but looking back now, every single warning sign was already written on the court. She was never supposed to be this big, this fast. Alexandra Eala, born in the Philippines, trained at Rafael Nadal's elite academy in Mallorca, entered 2025 ranked 140th in the world. A promising junior, a familiar name in Southeast Asia, but largely invisible to the global commercial machine that drives women's tennis. That was the version of Alex Eala the WTA thought they understood. That was the version they believed they controlled. What happened at the 2025 Miami Open shattered every assumption they held. As a wild card, a player handed entry as a courtesy, not a credential, Eala walked onto those hard courts and proceeded to dismantle 3 Grand Slam champions in succession, Jelena Ostapenko, Madison Keys, and then, in the match that stopped an entire nation, she defeated Iga Swiatek, the 2-time world #1, in front of a crowd that had come expecting a formality and witnessed a coronation instead. The internet combusted. Millions of Filipino fans who had never purchased a WTA ticket, never subscribed to a WTA streaming platform, never worn WTA merchandise, descended on every platform simultaneously. Alex Eala trended globally for 72 consecutive hours. Brands that had never engaged with women's tennis began sliding into WTA boardroom inboxes. The attention was biblical in its scale, sudden in its arrival, and completely centered on one name. By the end of that tournament, Eala had not won the title. She lost to Jessica Pegula in the semifinals, but she had done something far more consequential than lifting a trophy. She had proven in the most undeniable language commerce understands, audience, that she was the WTA's most valuable asset walking the planet. The organization saw the numbers. They watched the viewership spike. They observed sponsors circling her name like satellites locking onto a signal. And so, in the months that followed, the WTA did what institutions always do when something extraordinary falls into their lap. They reached out. They extended partnership proposals. They brought Alex Eala into their marketing architecture and positioned her at the center of their most ambitious global campaign in years, a sweeping initiative designed to elevate women's tennis to new commercial heights across Asia, North America, and Western Europe. Alex Eala, the girl who had spent years grinding through ITF circuits and qualifying rounds, who had publicly described her journey as one step at a time, was now the face of the future. The WTA needed her. She represented something authentic, magnetic, and impossible to manufacture. The organization knew it. Their sponsors knew it. The global audience made it undeniably clear. And yet, somewhere behind the glass doors of the WTA's executive offices, a decision was being shaped that would prove catastrophic. A decision built on arrogance, institutional pride, and a staggering misreading of where the power in this equation truly resided. The campaign launched. The buzz was enormous, but deep beneath the surface, a rupture was forming. And when it finally cracked open, it took $500 million with it. The details of what exactly transpired between Alex Eala's team and the WTA's marketing division remain disputed in their specifics, but devastating in their consequence. What is not disputed, 30 days after the campaign launched with Eala as its centerpiece, the WTA quietly, almost clinically, removed her from it. No press release, no public statement, no acknowledgement directed at the fans who had made her the campaign's entire gravitational pull. One morning, the promotional imagery shifted. The social media graphics evolved. The WTA's featured ambassador lineup was updated across their official digital platforms, and Alex Eala's face was gone, replaced by a rotation of established names, safer choices, players the organization had controlled relationships with for years. Sources close to the negotiations described the moment as a collision between two fundamentally different understandings of creative control. The WTA, as the narrative goes, wanted Eala's face, her story, her extraordinary Filipino fan base, but on their terms, under their editorial authority, fitted into their existing campaign framework with minimal accommodation for the distinct cultural identity she carried onto every court she stepped on. What the 30 days exposed went far deeper than one campaign decision. It revealed the fragile architecture of institutional power in a sport increasingly governed not by organizations, but by individual stars and the communities those stars magnetize. For decades, the WTA had operated as the authoritative voice of women's tennis, scheduling tournaments, managing rankings, distributing prize money, setting the terms of commercial engagement. The players competed within that structure. The sponsors engaged through that structure. The media covered what that structure elevated. Eala's crisis and the market response to it demonstrated that the architecture had shifted, that a single player, sufficiently beloved, sufficiently connected to a sufficiently passionate fan base, could redirect commercial gravity in 30 days. That the WTA's leverage over its own commercial future was no longer unconditional. That the most valuable thing the organization possessed was not its history, its brand, or its institutional authority. It was the human beings competing within it, and specifically, the few whose presence turned casual observers into obsessive advocates. This is not unprecedented in sports. Similar reckonings have arrived in other leagues, other organizations, other moments where an institution discovered that a player had outgrown the frame the institution provided. But in women's tennis in 2025 and 2026, the scale of what Eala represented made the lesson unusually vivid and unusually costly. Sports business analysts noted in the aftermath that Eala's situation exposed something the WTA had perhaps been reluctant to confront: the asymmetry between the organization's commercial dependency on star power and its institutional culture of treating players as interchangeable within a larger machine. When those two realities collided in the form of one 20-year-old from the Philippines who happened to be the most commercially magnetic player her sport had produced in a generation, the institutional culture lost. Expensively, publicly, permanently. Because even after the partnership resumed, even after the revised campaign launched and the brands returned and the streaming negotiations reopened, the dynamic had fundamentally changed. Everyone inside women's tennis understood with absolute clarity that Eala would never again be treated as an asset the WTA held. She was an asset she chose to share with them. And that distinction would define every conversation that followed. Months later, with the dust of the crisis long settled, the story of those 30 days sits in the consciousness of sports business and tennis culture as something instructive rather than merely dramatic. For the WTA, it became a case study in institutional humility, the kind that must be learned because it cannot be taught. The organization emerged from the crisis structurally intact, but reputationally altered, with a clearer understanding of what their commercial future required and a demonstrated willingness, however belated, to meet their most valuable players where they stand, rather than where precedent dictates they should be placed. For the brands that paused, withdrew, and then returned, their behavior during those 30 days revealed something about how sophisticated commercial partners evaluate not just star power, but star safety. They watched the crisis unfold. They measured the audience response. They concluded that Eala's value was not merely numerical. It was civic, cultural, and emotional in ways that made her removal genuinely dangerous to associate with. Their return was not simply about revenue recovery. It was about association with a story that had, through its own internal logic, become even more compelling than it had been before the dispute began. And Eala herself, still only 20 years old, still ascending the rankings, still accumulating the milestones that define generational careers, had added one more chapter to an already extraordinary biography. The chapter that proved she wasn't simply a player rising within the system. She was the system, learning to recognize itself in her. And the question worth sitting with, the question that the tennis world will be asking for years as her career unfolds, is this. If a 20-year-old from the Philippines could move $500 million in 30 days simply by being absent, what happens to the sport when she's fully, undeniably, irrevocably present? Leave that answer in the comments, because this story, it's nowhere close to finished. If you followed this from the beginning, you already knew she was different. Subscribe, because when the next chapter breaks, you'll want to be here first. Eala's own response, delivered through her team, later elaborated in an interview that circulated widely across sports media, was characteristically more elegant than the moment perhaps required. She did not twist the blade. She did not perform triumph. She spoke about the future, about the sport she loved, about the responsibility that came with representing the Philippines on the world's largest stages. She said she hoped the renewed relationship would reflect something genuine, something that actually shows who I am and where I come from. Those words landed differently than the WTA's statement because they arrived without the fingerprints of damage control. They arrived as what they were, the words of someone who had never stopped knowing her own worth, even when a powerful institution briefly forgot it. The Filipino public and the global tennis community watching this unfold responded with the kind of emotional release that only comes after sustained, justified tension. The reaction was not gloating, it was vindication. And there is a crucial difference. Vindication carries with it a sense of something restored, something corrected, the satisfaction of a story arriving, however belatedly, at its right outcome. But the questions being asked in every sporting forum, every fan community, every sports business analysis were not merely about the resolution. They were about what the resolution revealed.